Hello, welcome to Longford Castle. I'm Alexandra Ormerod, Principal Guide of the Longford Castle Collection.
And I'm Debbie Bitchener. I specialise in artist techniques and materials.
We have a special highlight tour for you today here at the Castle Estate, which is some 3 miles outside of the city of Salisbury. I'm going to be your guide, and my colleague Debbie will give her specialist insight into a few of the many incredible paintings we'll see along the way. We both wanted to show you the exterior of the castle because it's a remarkable repository for the collection. It's originally Elizabethan in design, completed in 1591, and it was the architectural whim of 2 of Elizabeth I's principal courtiers, her favourites. They set aside a fine bedroom for her to stay in, and Elizabeth I allowed the 2 courtiers, Lord Thomas Gorges and Helena Snackenberg, to have the funding from one of the Spanish galleons that had been sunk. It was originally a triangular castle with a moat round the outside. It's been modified over the centuries, firstly in the 1790s, when James Wyatt was commissioned by the then 2nd Earl of Radnor to double the size of it, a certain hubris, possibly to accommodate his growing art collection. This was a project that was never completed. And then in the 1860s, Anthony Salvin, the architect, was commissioned to restore the castle. He rebuilt a number of the Elizabethan elements. He was also sensitive to those Georgian features, and he was given carte blanche to add his own Victorian vision as well. And you'll see all of those architectural stages as we go through the castle today. Longford is a trove of history, of family narrative, of decorative features, of furniture, and of course, of art. If you would like to visit, look out for opportunities to book in-person tours. But bookings, of course, are limited. So we hope that this condensed tour will give you the opportunity to see what Longford has to offer. Now, let's go inside. Our story starts here with this small, carefully observed portrait of Lawrence de Bouverie, ancestor of the current Lord Radnor, painted by a follower of Cornelis Johnson in the latter half of the 16th century. Now, Lawrence lived just outside of Lille, which was then part of the Spanish Netherlands, under Catholic Habsburg rule. And he was a Huguenot, a follower of John Calvin, and also a staunch Protestant. Because of his faith, he had to become a religious refugee. I mean, he was going to be turned into the Inquisition by his father for not attending Mass. And a close friend of his had been burnt at the stake. Now, he settled initially in Frankfurt, where he learned his trade as a silk manufacturer. And then in 1574, he moved to the City of London, where he became a founder member of firstly the Turkey Company and then the Levant Company, a silk trader, trading in the Middle and the Far East. During his lifetime, he became a moderately wealthy man, but subsequent generations of the family, also silk merchants, accrued fabulous wealth. Now, the rewards were great along that silk route, but also the risks. And there are family tombs in Aleppo, in Constantinople, and in Cyprus, and at various places along that silk trail. We've come now into this central entrance hall. At one time, this was open to the elements with a beautiful fountain in the centre. It was rather Italianate in feel, covered over in the 1870s. And now it's hung with fine paintings and also with these Flemish tapestries dating to the 17th century and also designed by David Tenier. But we're going to look at 2 marble busts by the Flemish sculptor Michael Rysbrack. And they are of Edward de Bouverie and his brother Jacob, both of them descendants of Laurens. Now, both of them were silk merchants and both of them had amassed considerable fortunes. Edward had spent half of his life as a silk merchant in Aleppo, apprenticed there from the young age of 12. In 1717, when trade was on the wane, he decided to invest in property in the southwest of England. And the family story has it that he was riding past Longford. He loved this triangular castle that he saw, and he had enough money on him to buy it outright. He had no children, so his inheritance passed to his younger brother, Jacob. Now, Jacob was a connoisseur of the arts and a president of what we now call the Royal Society of Arts. So he set about embellishing Longford. He refurbished rooms, he employed fine craftsmen, he commissioned furniture, he re-landscaped the gardens, but he also created a collection. He purchased works by Hans Holbein, by Nicolas Poussin, by Claude Lorraine, some Italian old masters, and then a large body of Dutch and Flemish works. Just to clarify the family names, because it's quite confusing, he anglicised the family name to Bouverie, from de Bouverie, to cite them in English society. He himself was ennobled to Viscount Folkestone in 1747, and his son gained the title the Earl of Radnor in 1765. Both his son and his grandson were also collectors, adding a couple of hundred paintings to the collection and also commissioning portraits from Gainsborough and from Reynolds. So we have a collection here which has grown through each generation, remarkably with very few disposals. We've come now into the billiard room, which is the family sitting room. At one time, this was a formal entrance hall with a mezzanine floor. We're going to make our way through into the southwest alcove because it's a good location to give you a background of the history and the relationship between the National Gallery and Longford, one that has extended back over 150 years, and why you're listening to this collaborative event today. In 1861, Charles Deaslake, keeper of the National Gallery, visited Longford, and on his return to the National Gallery, he wrote a memorandum, his wish list, which included Holbein's portrait of Erasmus and Holbein's double portrait of the ambassadors. Now, this wish was ultimately fulfilled because Erasmus is now on long-term loan to the National Gallery from Longford, and the ambassadors was sold in 1890 en bloc with two other paintings in order to pay for death duties and for Salvin's restoration work by the fifth Earl and his wife, Helen Matilda Chaplin. And we have two portraits of this couple here. And the portrait that I'm going to concentrate on is the portrait of Helen Matilda. She's painted by James Jabuza Shannon, an Anglo-American artist, very much influenced by John Singer Sargent, and I think you can see that looking at this portrait. Also, when you look at these representations of the wives, these are not so many last duchesses hung flatly on the wall. These are women of intellect, of agency, who had a key involvement not only in the collection, but in the running of the castle and the estate. And Helen Matilda, she catalogued the entire collection, a labour of love, and it's due to her that we know the provenance of so many of the paintings. You can see that she's shown here at her piano, the Bechstein piano. She was a really keen musician, a professional amateur. And during the last few decades of the 19th century, she conducted an all-female orchestra. She called it her string band of 80 ladies strong. And can you see she's wearing a tiara? This is the family tiara. She would place that on the back of her head so that members of the audience could enjoy the sparkle of the stones. Unlike so many of the previous wives, she outlived her husband by 30 years, and she had a fruitful widowhood. Some of that time she spent in Venice, where she bought an apartment, and on one occasion she commissioned the building of a gondola, which she brought back to Longford. And she also brought back her trusted gondolier, and he spent a number of years in England with her. So Helen Matilda was a woman of intellect, a woman of capability, a woman of substance, but also a woman of character. One of the heartening features of the collection is that we have a number of women artists represented here. Works by Angelica Kaufman, Mary Beale, Margaret Sarah Carpenter, Laura Ford, Brenda Burry and Emma Sargent. But this painting by Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun, I think, is one of the finest of that grouping. The gentleman goes on to become the third Earl, and he is on his grand tour, which has encompassed Scandinavia, and he is in Russia at the time, in St. Petersburg. And Vigée-Lebrun, of course, having to flee the French Revolution, worked her way through Europe. She's also in St. Petersburg. So this is a rather romantic portrait of this young man. He's at liberty. He hasn't taken on the mantle of Longford and his future career. He's set in an imagined landscape, his arm on that great rock. I don't think it's any coincidence that he was painted by Vigée-Lebrun, because both he and his family were Francophones and Francophiles, having travelled extensively in France. And apparently they'd met with Marie Antoinette and also with Louis XVI, and they'd visited the Bastille the day after it was stormed. I've come now into the round white parlour, which is an original Elizabethan tower room. And we have this beautiful, elegant, pale Georgian paintwork on the wall with the gilding, and also multiple aspects, which makes this room a light and airy space. And you also have this view out through to the formal gardens and the estate. And through this window, we can see a sculpture by Michael Craig Martin, a recent acquisition to the collection, and it shows you that the collection is always evolving. It's not static. And also it makes a lovely juxtaposition with one of the original acquisitions to the collection, this portrait bought by Deycester in the 18th century. This is a portrait by Quentin Massis, an Antwerp-based artist, painting in 1517. It's a painting with an illustrious provenance. It was owned by the Duke of Mantua. It was in the collection of Charles I, and it was also owned by Sir Thomas More, because Sir Thomas More was a very close friend of the sitter, Pieter Gillis. He'd visited him in Antwerp a number of times. And we know that both the sitter was a very close friend of Erasmus, as was Sir Thomas More. And Gillis and Erasmus had this idea that they would have their portraits done to be gifted to Sir Thomas More so that he could enjoy their likenesses virtually when he wasn't with their company. And within this painting, we have many references to their scholarship and also their tripartite friendship. Gillis was a humanist scholar. We can see his learned books behind, and he held a prominent position in the Council of Antwerp. He received this letter in Latin that you can see him holding from Sir Thomas More. And More was so delighted that the artist had caught his handwriting so faithfully that he asked for the original one back and pinned it up next to the portrait. painting that sits so well in this light, bright space is this winterscape attributed to Heinrich Avercamp. It's an ice skating scene outside of the city of Kampen, which is to the northeast of Amsterdam. Everybody is out on the ice, all strata of society, from the wealthy patricians in the foreground, well-dressed, to the market traders on the left-hand side, selling laces for the skates, and also sharpening the blades to the skates. When we have visitors on in-person tours, they really enjoy looking at all the anecdotal details. So let me show you a few today. In the centre, we have the artist himself, looking back at us, doffing his cap, rather touchingly now, across the centuries. He's also inscribed his initials onto the inn shutters and into the lattice work of wood that is on the roof to the building. Everybody's playing kolf, which was a forerunner to golf. And then there are a few visual quotes to Bruegel, because of course Avercamp was so influenced by Bruegel. This was bought originally as a Bruegel. You've got the upturned door in the foreground, a bird-catching device. And then here by this diaphanous tent on the right-hand side, you've got a gentleman who is overtly relieving himself. So all of life is out on the ice.
The family invariably employed the most preeminent portrait painters of their day to paint them. This painting is by Thomas Gainsborough. It is of the first Earl, painted in 1773. The first and second Earls loved Gainsborough, and they invited him to come and stay at the castle on 2 occasions to paint portraits of the family. Gainsborough was a self-taught artist, and he painted his pictures from beginning to end by himself, which was actually quite unusual in the 18th century. He would have set up a temporary studio here at the castle, and I like to think that the family would have loved watching him at work. He would do his initial lay-in, first underlayer of the painting, in semi-darkness in candlelight, using specially constructed brushes which were 6 feet long. He would then throw open the shutters and allow the daylight to come in to do his final painting with finer brushes and using very liquid paint, which his daughter Anne described as running off his palette. His great friend Ozias Humphrey said that his aim was to capture a true likeness of his sitters, and I feel that this painting looks very honest. And I like to think that it is the result not just of the relationship between an artist and his patron, but also the relationship between 2 friends.
We've come into the long parlour, which is the family dining room. It's a room that's lined with Georgian portraiture and also a large body of Dutch and Flemish work. A room remodelled by Anthony Salvin in the 1870s, and he added on these square alcoves, which gives you a view through to the formal gardens, redeveloped over the last 10 years. And also these intimate recesses allow for a close viewing of the more cabinet-style paintings. In particular, these 2 paintings by Frans Hals, painted in 1628 on panel. They are of 2 citizens of Haarlem, probably quite wealthy, judging by their clothing. They're a husband and wife. We know that the man is aged 66 and his wife is 60. It's inscribed in oil on the panel. Probably painted to mark a significant anniversary. Quite often these small paintings were done as preparatory works for larger engravings or prints, but that's not necessarily the case here. When you think of Frans Hals, you might think of his bold, distinctive brushwork, most obvious in his large portraits and also in his group compositions. But it's evident here in small scale. So if we have a closer look at them, you can see the gentleman's ruff, the way that it is suggested by the brushwork, and also the way it merges with the muzzle of his beard and also with his moustache. And then with the lady, you can see these beautiful rubicund cheeks on her complexion and the very sympathetic portrayal of her character. We warm to her. These are people of flesh and blood. We can see the glint of light that falls onto her thumbnail and onto that slightly arthritic thumb as well. Back in the 17th century, these paintings would have hung side by side. Today, they hang opposite each other in this recess, looking at each other, rather touchingly now, in perpetuity. A few paintings were included as contents when Sir Edward Bouverie bought the castle in 1717, including this portrait of Queen Henrietta Maria by Sir Anthony van Dyck. Painted in 1632, this was one of the first portraits that Van Dyck did of Henrietta Maria, and he did some 30 throughout her life. It was painted as a virtuoso piece because he had to impress his monarchs. She was aged 24 at the time, and she didn't particularly like sitting. I think she was quite a restless individual. She's shown with her imperial crown by her right elbow, tucked there discreetly, of course because she was a most contentious monarch because of her Catholicism. And her pose, she's cradling a flower, a rose, suggestive of the fact that she is pregnant, possibly the dates James, Duke of York. And then if we look up between her ringlets, you can see the glint of a pearl earring. This is a teardrop pearl. These came to be called the Mancini earrings, and they were gifted to Henrietta Maria by her mother, Marie de' Medici, on her marriage to King Charles. And they were pearls that she had to sell subsequent to civil unrest in order to raise funds for her husband and also to raise funds for herself. Rather gallingly, she sold them to her nephew, Louis XIV. So an exquisite portrait by Van Dyck, and you have to remember that Gainsborough visited Longford on 2 occasions, and he was so influenced by this portraitist. And when we get upstairs to the Long Gallery, you'll see we have 3 further portraits by the artist, including one of her brother, Gaston of Orléans, painted in Brussels.
As well as Gainsborough, the family employed his great rival, Sir Joshua Reynolds, who became the first president of the Royal Academy in 1768. Unlike Gainsborough, Reynolds had a very busy, big studio of assistants, and they collaborated together on the paintings. So the paintings are complex layer structures with work by both assistants and Reynolds. In addition, Reynolds was a great experimenter. He believed that there were secrets that the old masters had had, which needed to be rediscovered. And hence he would mix up all sorts of strange concoctions to paint with, including mixing in balsams and varnishes into his paint and interlayering with wax. The effects of this was sometimes to cause the paintings to age quite badly. So if we look at this portrait, which is of the future second Earl, painted in 1757, we can see that the background has become very, very dark and difficult to read. And then it has thrown the figure unnaturally forward. And also he looks very pale because certain glazes have faded that Reynolds used. He was using cochineal at this time. These effects would happen sometimes within a very short time after he had completed the paintings. So much so that people started to criticise Reynolds' work. And his friend George Beaumont felt driven to defend him by saying, even a faded painting by Reynolds is the best thing you'll ever have. Now, if we come to this painting here, which is painted in 1781, this is of the future wife of the third Earl, Lady Catherine Pelham Clinton. Prior to painting this painting, he released a statement in the Public Advertiser saying that Reynolds' studio have stopped using pigments such as cochineal in his work that fade and has started to use more permanent pigments such as vermilion. And if you look at the flesh on this painting, for example, you'll see how well it is preserved and how lovely and fresh it appears. He's also lightened up the tonality of the background as well, and his brushwork has loosened up. And this is because he studied the work of Rubens and improved his technique by studying that great master. I love the fact that if you look under her chin, you can see 2 very bright dashes of pure vermilion, as if to really embrace this new pigment, which has transformed his painting. And then here we have a wonderful painting from later in his life of Anne Duncombe, who was the wife of the second Earl. And she is shown in a pose which is very similar to a painting by Gainsborough, which was of Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire. And that, I think, reveals the very complicated relationship between these two artists, both of rivalry, but possibly also of admiration. And if we look at this painting, we can almost see some of that sort of feathery brushwork that we associate with Gainsborough. Overall, it's an absolutely stunning portrait. There are plenty more paintings by Reynolds in the collection for people to study and to see all the different phases of his work.
We've come up a spiral interior staircase and we've come into this beautiful jewel of a room. This is the Green Drawing Room, a room refurbished by Deycester in the 1740s. And he lined it with this Lyon velvet, which softens our voices and also our footsteps. But this was originally the ladies' bedchamber that was set aside for Elizabeth I by Lord Thomas Gorges and his Swedish wife. There would have been a four-poster bed in the centre and she would have had a prime view out to the River Avon. It's fitting that it's a room now lined with Tudor portraiture. We know that Elizabeth of Bohemia stayed in this room, elder sister to Charles I. And then in 1953, the late Queen Elizabeth visited Longford. So it's the room of the three Queen Elizabeths. So it's very fitting that we have an Elizabethan jewellery cabinet, a bijouterie cabinet. And let me show it to you now. Bought by the second Earl in the 18th century, the second Earl was of antiquarian tastes. He liked to buy artefacts which dated to the 16th century. Now, this originally contained a letter written by Elizabeth I, also other very precious items, and at a later stage it contained 5 miniatures by the limner Nicholas Hilliard, and those are now in the Victoria and Albert Museum. One of those was of Elizabeth I herself. Let me show you the inside of this cabinet. You can imagine each of these small drawers holding a miniature and jewels, and then this interior compartment with its plush red velvet, this heart-shaped lock traced, engraved and gilded. This would have held the items most precious to a lady, the most private, most dear to her heart. This is where the letter was stored. And then this drop front facade has iconography relating to the hunt and also a pelican. The pelican, the emblem, of course, of Elizabeth I, because the pelican was meant to pluck the feathers from its breast, to draw blood, to sacrifice itself, just as Elizabeth sacrificed herself to her people.
It is very appropriate that we have a portrait of Queen Elizabeth I in this room. She is shown in this portrait in older age. She has wrinkles, she has hollow cheeks and veins at her temples. She also, though, has rosebud lips, belying the fact that at this stage of her life, she had no teeth. The artist who has painted her is from the studio of Marcus Gerhards the Younger. Gerhards was from a family of Huguenots who escaped from Antwerp in the 16th century, and when they came to England, they were embraced by the court of Elizabeth I for their skills in depicting the courtiers. She is shown in one of her favourite colour schemes of black and white. She is wearing a ruff, which was probably made from Huguenot lace, and which may well have cost more than the jewels that she is wearing. The black denotes constancy, the white denotes chastity. The colour scheme is continued into her bejewelled hair, the pearls, and then what appear to be black diamonds, which are probably actually colourless diamonds laid over black velvet. She is wearing a red wig, which reminds us of her father, Henry VIII. And the overall image is one of self-sacrifice because she's careworn and she has the weight of her country on her shoulders, as implied by her association with the pelican. This lovely portrait of a young boy is by Sir Peter Paul Rubens. It's of Franz, his eldest son by his second wife, Hélène Formand. Rubens had a very busy studio in Antwerp. He employed about 32 assistants, and they worked on his major commissions for him. A painting like this, however, for Rubens' personal use, is probably painted from beginning to end by the master. He has painted the picture on a composite panel made up of a number of pieces of wood. These he would have had lying around in his studio. At the time, there was a shortage of oak in Northern Europe, so it made sense for Rubens to use up offcuts in his studio. The Guild would never have passed a panel like this, but it didn't matter because he was just going to use it for his own pleasure. If we look at the technique of the painting, we can see how he has portrayed these sumptuous fabrics, the lovely fresh flesh, and we can understand why artists like Reynolds and Vigée Lebrun looked at his technique and learnt from it for their own paintings.
We've come into the Long Picture Gallery, which is the main picture gallery at Longford, a room refurbished in the 1730s by Deycester. He had the walls lined in this green silk damask and commissioned fine Georgian furniture, and then set about hanging his prime, his most significant paintings. Now, this is the room where his grandson, the second Earl, hung Holbein's portrait of the ambassadors, which hung here for almost 100 years. It hung here, and think of that wonderful backdrop, how well placed it would have been against that green damask, and also the strange distorted skull in the foreground that you need to see at an oblique angle. As we walked into the room now, you'd have been at exactly the right angle to view the skull. And then we have two further pictures which are judiciously placed, which were two of the most significant paintings bought by Deycester. They are by Claude Lorraine, and they are a pendant pair. So to buy a pendant pair of Claude Lorraines in your own personal collection in the 18th century was a coup indeed. And we'll take a further look at them. These two paintings by Claude came to represent the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire. Not necessarily Claude's intention at all, because he painted them 6 years apart. At this end of the room, we have Aeneas arriving at the mouth of the Tiber with his son Ascanius into the kingdom of Latium, founding Rome. And you've got the island of Capri in the distance. And this is a sunrise painting. We know that John Constable visited Longford on 2 occasions, and he made copies of these two Claudes. And he was also to write later on that in a Claude painting, the sun ever shines. And Claude was so remarkable about his ability to depict light diffusing through the atmosphere. And I think you can really see this in this painting here. So we'll make our way to the far end and we'll have a look at the ruin, the decay of the Roman Empire. So in this pendant picture, we have the ruined Arch of Titus, the Colosseum in the background, and also a Roman aqueduct. So artistic license by Claude as to where all of these buildings are placed. And then in the foreground, you have an indolent shepherd who is reclining and pointing to a shepherdess who is heaving a goat through that milky, still pool, which contrasts with the lovely choppy waves in Aeneas arriving in Latium. Two paintings that are judiciously placed, because as you came into the room, you'd have viewed the sunrise, the rise of the empire, and as you left to go out at the end of the tour, you'd have looked back and you'd have viewed a sunset. In pride of place in the gallery is this steel chair made by Thomas Rucker in 1574 and placed directly opposite where would have been Holbein's portrait of the ambassadors. Now, this was made in Rucker's studio in Augsburg, and it was gifted by the city fathers as a diplomatic gift to Rudolphus II, who was then the Holy Roman Emperor, who allegedly sat in it for his coronation. It's a chair that's been cast, probably in that lost wax process, and then tooled into over 120 different scenes depicting classical mythology, also empire, and scenes from the Bible. And we'll look at a few of them which are above the main seat of the chair. Here you've got a scene from the book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor of Babylonia, is asleep in his four-poster bed with his bare arm hanging outside and his little crown on his bedside table, the slippers aligned underneath. And he's having his first dream of this giant figure made of many different metals. And then on the right-hand side, a rather diminutive Daniel is explaining the dream to him. And he's sat in a throne, rather nicely, a throne within a throne. And then above that, we have the Last Judgment. God is balancing on high above the disciples. And in order of priority, above God, you have Rudolphus himself with his crown on in profile, a little diminutive profile here. And above that, you have the emblem for the city of Augsburg, this fine pine cone, which is being held aloft by these two fleshy putti. So more a piece of sculpture than a piece of furniture.
We have this fabulous portrait by Sir Anthony van Dyck of Gaston d'Orléans, who was the brother of Queen Henrietta Maria. The painting came as part of the fixtures and fittings of the castle when Sir Edward bought it in 1717. Sir Anthony van Dyck set up a studio in 1632 in England. He established a studio at Blackfriars on the River Thames, where members of the court could come to have their portraits painted. He established a different style when he was in England, so in contrast to the rather rich style that you saw in the painting of Gaston d'Orléans, you can see that this painting of the Countess of Monmouth is far lighter in tone and looser in technique. You can see how he has made her very tall and elegant and idealised. With a flawless complexion, he has apparently said that ladies doth not like shadows. He has emphasised her wonderful, rich, golden orange dress. This shows her status, and it also makes an amazing compositional feature of the painting. The Countess of Chesterfield too is seen tall and elegant and also resplendent in silver grey. Mostly, Van Dyck's portraits were painted by his assistants, and for those paintings, Van Dyck would take a sitting of 1 hour with his client, and he would establish their head and shoulders, and then he would pass the painting over to his assistants who would complete it. For those paintings, he charged £30. Now, these two paintings, it is thought, are completely by the master. For those, he would have spent a very long day on the painting, apparently not stopping for lunch or anything. And for those paintings, he charged £60. This exquisite painting on copper is by the Flemish artist Jan Bruegel the Elder. He prepared the copper by rubbing it with garlic so that the paint would adhere to it. His choice of copper enabled him to achieve this jewel-like quality to the surface and the exquisite detail, which is why his nickname was Velvet Bruegel. It was painted in the spirit of the Counter-Reformation, so it was intended to inspire devotion in the viewer. Bruegel has painted flowers which bloom at all different times of the year, so that not only would you appreciate God's creation, but you would also be impressed by the skill of the artist. Erasmus had urged that art and nature should be brought together to inspire devotion. Jacob bought this painting in 1744, and he hung it here in this position in order to inspire devotion in people who were just entering the room behind me, which is the chapel. It is lovely for visitors who come to the castle now that they can see the painting hanging where it has hung for the last 280 years.
We've come back down to the central entrance hall, and we're going to conclude with this portrait of William, the current Earl of Radnor, painted by Emma Sargent in 1989. He's in that green drawing room which we visited, we've just come back down from, with that plush backdrop of Lyon velvet. Like his ancestors, William's had a lifetime involvement in the arts. His mother was an artist. For some time, he was a furniture specialist with Christie's, and he's also been involved in those creative regenerative projects in the town of Folkestone in Kent. He's also a collector, like his ancestors, and he's collected both contemporary British art and sculpture. He curates his own collection, and both his care and custodianship of the collection and the building ensures the preservation of his and the collection's heritage. The fact that Longford is his lived experience, it's his family home, and that he has added to the collection, ensures that the place has a dynamic future. He's also carried on that tradition of short and long-term loans to the National Gallery. And he has strengthened those ties by instigating this project of collaborative tours. As you know, Longford Castle is open to the public on selected dates through the spring, the summer and the autumn for in-person tours. It really just remains for me to say thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure for Debbie and I to take you round this tour route, and our team of guides hope to welcome you here very soon.